Bienvenida hoy. Soy Carla
Good
Sáenz.
morning. Welcome. My name is Carla Sainz, a regional advisor for the Bioethics program at PAHO. Before we get started with our session, I would like to inform everyone that we have simultaneous interpretation available into English and Spanish. To access the feature, please click on the globe icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language of your preference from the pop-up menu.
We have interpretation from and to English and Spanish. So if you want to hear the session in English, please click on that little globe that says interpretation and click on the language on which you want to listen to the session. So without further ado, sin más antelación,
Without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to get us started to Dr. Sebastián García Sáenz, Director of the Evidence and Intelligence for Healthcare Department. And he will discuss the topic of bioethics and give us some opening remarks. Go ahead, Dr. Sebastián. Thank you very much, Carla, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to join everyone in this seminar that will allow us to delve more deeply into the implications derived from the lessons learned due to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the need of to strengthen our mechanisms and our various healthcare systems to undertake a complete review of the bioethical considerations related to everything that we do and how we respond to different healthcare emergencies, and what this means to different groups, be they research and other committees and the generation of said committees, as well as the authorities that are in charge of developing policies as well as response mechanisms to some of these challenges in the public health arena. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to look at the country perspective, not just the regional perspective, and this vision that is incorporated into this great document involving catalyzing bioethical considerations to address healthcare emergencies. And this allows us to see the vision as to what is required, but it also allows us to understand the implications for each country in practical terms. And of course, counting on all of you is a great opportunity for PAHO and every one of the countries involved and that address these issues in our day-to-day work lives. Then we can perhaps together come up with a much better response. So Carla, once again, for the opportunity, thank you for the opportunity to join you here today. I wish you the best for this seminar today, and that your efforts have proved to be very useful. Thank you, Sebastián. Without further ado, let me just describe how we will proceed in this presentation, or rather this session. I will give you a brief presentation of the general content of the Catalyzing Ethical Research document, and we are sharing the link to the website here in the chat room. We will also share a QR code shortly so that you can access the website. Then I will move on to the recommendations. And the objective for this session is for us to discuss those actions that we need to undertake today to bring about improvement, not just in our ethical preparation to address emergencies, but also to address research ethics. After that, we will open the floor for discussion so that we can hear the insights and comments, both from the perspective of the health authority as well as the bioethical community. But when we get to that point, I will then provide the information for the case study that we'll be discussing. As I was saying, and as Sebastián was emphasizing, this monograph is a publication issued by PAHO, but it's primarily a regional product. and it's a product derived from many discussions and dialogues that we've undertaken. And we've had researchers, committees, authorities, regulatory, national authorities discussing what works, what doesn't work, and what needs to be done to address these issues. Now you can access the website by using this QR code. And I'd like to highlight that this work carried out by PAHO has been financed by Welcome Track. Now, when we talk about the general publication of the complete document, it's been followed by other derivative products that are more specific, and these are also accessible to all of you on the publication website by using the same QR code. And I'd also say that during the course of this week, on the same website, we will be uploading some sets of slides so that if any of you would like to present this information in whatever academic spaces you work in or with committees or colleagues that you collaborate on a regular basis in your countries, you can use these slides, which we offer for everybody's use. So I'm sharing this information today so you won't need to try and capture all of these specific slides. This seminar today is being recorded, and you will get the QR code that will allow you access to all that information. So this integrates, reviews, and supplements the previous ethical guidance that was developed. And this was largely derived from many of the responses that took place during COVID. We noticed a number of gaps during the pandemic that were brought to light, and we observed that we didn't just have a guidance document that informed the actions of various arenas, but it also includes lessons learned, best practices, and these are going to be the main topic of discussion for us. The key messages that we'd like to share with you today include that we do learn a great deal from lessons that we learn during healthcare emergencies. And I want to emphasize this message because I do believe that in the majority of conferences and global fora, in bioethics and the international arena, this is something that we haven't really taken to heart. And I do believe that we learned a great deal from the lessons learned during healthcare emergencies, but the learning process needs to drive immediate action. We need to take action today to be able to improve our future actions and strengthen our various healthcare mechanisms. So what we need to do right away is implement the recommendations outlined in the document. I think that many of us see COVID as a distant part of our past, but we need to ask ourselves, what was the most challenging element for the region from an ethical perspective? And much of this is based on the non-ethical use of unproven interventions and outside of the recognized research. It was difficult to conduct proper ethical monitoring of different studies and research projects that were carried out. So it was very difficult to manage this problem. And another great challenge was the mistrust that existed in different arenas, research, healthcare authorities, and healthcare professionals. And all of this stemmed from what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. On a positive side, each one of these three topics are key topics outlined in Chapter 5 in the MEORI framework. Chapter 4 addresses ethical monitoring based on evidence, and another chapter addressed the issue of mistrust. I'm going to speak briefly about these chapters and then set aside more time for our discussion. The first chapter addresses the lessons learned from the Zika outbreak and other challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I stated, we do learn a great
Muchos temas que fueron difíciles en Zika ya estaban resueltos y no generaron problema cuando nos encontramos con la pandemia. La respuesta procesos de consentimiento informado, etcétera, etcétera.
This included informed consent procedures, etc. But we also showed evidence that the region undertook a great deal of research in a very rapid way. And we understand that there are still persisting challenges, and we were trying to address these challenges in a collective fashion during the pandemic, and that's allowed us to collect a great deal of evidence. The second chapter addresses how to strengthen the trust in the research that is carried out during emergencies. Is transparency and society involvement something that we require? Ethical research presumes a number of tasks related to society, their involvement, and proper information. And what we saw here was the relationship between the production of knowledge and the verification thereof. So if we don't understand how the research is undertaken and what the product was based on, say a vaccine, then it's hard for us to verify that vaccine. And in this chapter, we give examples of different actions undertaken by national authorities to address transparency and societal involvement. And we also highlighted some additional actions that were carried out by authorities and other stakeholders. The third chapter is the most read in the monograph, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, not just in our region, but at the global level. And it relates to ethical review processes and how we can ensure that ethical review and proper monitoring are applied in a rigorous but expedited way. In our region, I think we bet very heavily on a two-front approach. First, we thought about a strategy at the national level that avoids any duplication of efforts when it came to the review process. And once we adopted a strategy, we came up with procedures to ensure that the review process undertaken by each committee could be done in the most expedited way possible. I'm not saying that this happened in every country, but I think that in our region, we've seen a great effort to try to rethink how to do this in the best way, not necessarily based on a specific committee, but rather on larger efforts conducted at the national level. Chapter 4 talks about the ethical monitoring of research in light of new evidence that arises very quickly, and we needed to come up with guidance for this monitoring process, both on the operational side as well as the substantive side. When this is happening so quickly, we have to undertake the process of understanding who's doing what's been done and what have you. Additionally, the substantive part of this application led to questions that served to guide the ethical analysis. This was based on social value, scientific value, and we also have additional questions to assess the ethical nature of controls with placebo when they were authorized. And I'm not going to take too much more time, but the fifth chapter addresses the Muri framework, and it asks the question, how can we ensure during healthcare emergencies the ethical use of unproven interventions outside of the research arena? So we have a number of ethical criteria, justification, ethical supervision, and regulatory supervision, informed consent procedures, and contribution to the generation of evidence. Now, this came up with the recommendations, both general and operational, as well as other outcomes. Chapter 6 addresses something that we didn't talk about that much during the pandemic, and it involves how we can ensure that we can share samples and data in an ethical way to incentivize future research. We've come to realize, or actually, before I talk about that, I'd like to say that we speak of this because before the pandemic, we all had cases, we all had data, we all had available samples, but of course, we hope that in a future emergency, we don't have that kind of problem. So in this chapter, we try to provide some guidance that addresses the collection of both these data as well as samples for future use and future ethical analysis. And we also address the storage and the transfer of these elements. So forgive me for being so brief in my description of the content of the document. The document is available for you to peruse in greater detail. But now I'd like to focus the discussion on the final recommendations. And we've learned a great deal about things that apply to emergencies, but we also have lessons that we learned that are applicable to any kind of situation, including emergencies. And some of these recommendations are ready to be implemented. These are recommendations for action, but we still have recommendations that still require a conceptualization process. In the cases of all of the recommendations, we provided details on the key stakeholders that need to take action or need to be involved in the action. And the most prominent stakeholders include healthcare authorities as well as ethical committees and others. So when we look at the upper left quadrant, we need to look at the recommendations for healthcare authorities. Healthcare authorities need to develop strategies and ethical monitoring and review procedures that address the needs of emergencies. And this is not just applicable to COVID-19, but much of what was developed was specifically geared for the pandemic. So these same strategies, these same procedures that we had already identified could not be used any further because they were specifically geared for COVID-19. So our emergency mode needs to be formalized and standardized, and it needs to be applicable to any type of healthcare emergency. Another recommendation included assigning relevant research authorities the responsibility of coordinating research efforts. One great challenge that we've had is that the research undertaking was extremely uncoordinated. And we need to try and coordinate this, and we need to at least identify a personal or a responsible party to undertake the coordination of all of these research efforts. As long as we don't have any one entity or person coordinating this, we won't ever have any coordination. Now, we also need to address the different elements in the response teams. And for this type of collaboration, we need to have a point of contact with the research element so that the emergency response people can have that kind of support. Additionally, we need to establish processes so that the various countries can benefit from the results and findings of any research. We've seen a tremendous amount of research carried out on COVID-19 vaccines. And these vaccines took some time in arriving. And perhaps if we had come up with a plan to involve the national authorities to benefit from these studies from the outset, we would have had a better approach. Now, for the scientific community, international organizations, and healthcare authorities, it is absolutely key to develop generic protocols that are pre-approved and that could subsequently be adjusted to address a specific emergency. This is something that we did during Zika, but now during peacetime, I think it would be prudent for us to come up with generic protocols that will be available for us to adapt to our needs. Now, for any situation, we had a very important recommendation that carried a great deal of weight in our region, and that is that we need to compensate, be it economically or in some other way, all of the members in the team for their time and recognize their work and facilitate the agility. These are people that work several hours a day, every day, and they do it without proper compensation. And we need to be able to compensate the ethical committee members for their time and efforts. And both the ethical committees and healthcare authorities need to incorporate virtual mechanisms in a routine way. Many groups held many meetings during COVID online, but they stopped doing that. And whenever a meeting is a little bit more challenging than it needs to be, you could easily go to an online platform and have the meeting. Additionally, we need to allow for various types of informed consent procedures, and these need to be accessible to anybody who needs them. Additionally, another recommendation is to establish procedures to determine what proposals require ethical review. If it's a particularly difficult topic, I mean, clearly these procedures in some cases continue to be very difficult. And so for ethical committees, we need to require that whenever researchers submit a proposal for a review, they need to include their documents and we need to create mechanisms, for example, social media to communicate and create awareness among the public regarding any study that is being reviewed or supervised in case it's deemed necessary. So we need to create these mechanisms right now during peacetime, and these could be very useful not only for emergencies, but we could run into difficulties even when we're not dealing with an emergency. For any situation, another recommendation for healthcare authorities is to create mechanisms to inform ethical committee members on reviews and non-approvals, previous non-approvals from other ethical committees as needed. I know that many ethical committee members are concerned about this. Additionally, I think we need to institute a requirement that any clinical trials be registered in records that will be stored by the WHO prior to initiating. Many times, research is undertaken without ensuring that all of the clinical trials are properly registered and have the adequate visibility and are easily identified and are identifiable and placed in a clearinghouse of sorts at WHO. Additionally, we need to create a website with all of the research undertaken and approved for human studies in any country. And in this case, we need to look at approved projects, unapproved projects, clinical trials, what have you. Additionally, we need to take on the task of informing the public on the research being conducted to facilitate the involvement of society, and it also encourages and instills more trust in the research findings. Healthcare authorities, as well as international organizations such as WHO and PAHO, need to advocate for expanding the clinical trials arena so that it includes and safeguards all of the research related to human studies, not just clinical trials. We've been talking about this since 2013, but we've been lagging behind in making this a reality. Additionally, another recommendation stems from the fact that we see an urgent need to undertake capacity building with regard to research ethics, making the distinction between human research and other public health activities, the Muri framework, the ethical use of samples and data in future research, adaptive design, any exposure studies involving human beings, online studies, scientific integrity. And since we're talking about online studies, we will soon be announcing a new workshop that will involve 4 sessions focused on the use of materials and data transfer agreements for research that involves collaborators. And for those of you who are not registered on the PAHO mailing list, we suggest that you do so because we will be sending out the invitation for this workshop very promptly and very shortly. Now, in terms of conceptualizing and designing the tasks that we will need to carry out, all of this requires a mechanism that will provide better coordination for the research. During the pandemic, we talked about how the registration can help us with the coordination, but the truth is, as we've discussed before, by the time we get to the registration, it's too late. We need to know in advance if any research is being planned, and we want to understand what's being planned, what research is going to be done. And in this way, we can avoid having to undertake many smaller scale projects. Now, when we talk about national efforts, we realize that there's no regional central clearinghouse for clinical trials. And in many cases, we need to provide detail and try to understand how to overcome some of these issues. And hopefully, by the time we are met with another emergency, we can use the lessons learned during COVID to improve any future response. Additionally, we need to think about those mechanisms for ethical supervision of research at the sub-regional level we can implement at the regional level, even at the supra-regional level. And perhaps we can talk about this later on, but for example, in some of the smaller countries, we could consider some extraterritorial supervision mechanisms.
And this is a situation not only for emergencies, but we also need to express new strategies that would facilitate for ethical supervision carried out by various committees that are in charge of this become more simple, better coordinated, and we could have maybe just one review, simultaneous reviews, or we might establish mechanisms to adopt the review carried out by a different ethical committee, so with a delegation of responsibility, etc. So this is something that we're trying to understand from PAHO, and also with the help of some countries that are deeply interested in making progress in this area and also thinking as to how we can make progress. Once again, for those who were unable to join us in time, I am sharing the QR code that shows the publication online. And now, since the goal here is to determine, based on these recommendations, what is it that we are going to do? What is it that we can do to make progress? What are the difficulties that we are facing to implement these recommendations. And here I show you the specific documents with the recommendations for the health authorities as well as for the ethics committees and research committees. It is a pleasure to open up the space for a dialogue. I would like to present, and we will start with Dr. Jimena Luengo. We invite you to turn on your camera. She is a surgeon who specializes in teens. She has a master's degree in public health and also bioethics information. And for a while, she has been coordinating advisor on bioethics for the Ministry of Health of Chile. She has also led the Committee on Health Development, and she is tasked from the point of view of the health authority in Chile to supervise with supervision of the committees. So we are going to give the floor now to the comments, the discussion by Jimena, and then I will introduce the next panel member. Jimena, please go ahead. Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation from PAHO to be able to participate in this incredible seminar. I see that we have many participants, and this is on a very interesting topic. First of all, I would like to start by saying that I think it is tremendously important and almost an example if we think of the work that was coordinated by PAHO to systematize the experience that had been obtained in the region with the previous pandemic. I think this was a visionary attitude to see how, based on the experience and the various acts that happened, that was able to be put into a systematized system. This document has very important contributions that are important not only for the emergencies, as our colleague just mentioned, but this document provides guidelines for the work carried out by scientific committees. In a way, there are recommendations as to how to assess, how to look at risk, and this is something that is not done not only during emergencies, but this is a good piece of work to consult and use as a guideline for the work that they do. In connection with emergency situations, as we have already heard, we will continue to face emergencies, and this document is inviting us to get ahead and plan how to face these emergencies and moments when we are not living through an emergency, so that we can get ahead of the situation and we can do it in a way so that we can provide a fast answer, a rapid answer that is consistent, systematized, based on the situations that we just described. I would like to highlight some elements in particular in connection with this document from the point of view of what the authorities have to do. I would say that an important issue, and as Carla mentioned, is how we need to coordinate in a rapid but solid fashion the work of the authorities that create the standards, the procedures, or the regulations or the laws in connection with the researchers who work on the field, and also the scientific committees that also work to protect the health, the well-being, and the dignity of those who participate. I would say that based on what we see, the way to coordinate this work would give us also good results for all of us, going back to the aspect that we have already mentioned. But also this emergency situation also led to a challenge to coordinate among the various ethics and scientific committees in the country. Why am I saying this? Because the various experiences show us how we need to use the knowledge that we have gained in the bioethics field at the national level and also at the level of at the international level. And sometimes we do not have committees, but we do have some other committees that are authorized to work in that area, because oftentimes the work conducted by one committee is insufficient and they need to resort to others. And how these others are also contributing efficiency, efficacy to attain a cross-cutting outlook to better understand the various situations. As Carla mentioned, these are situations that create some complexities, for example, when we have epidemiological outbreaks. And on the other hand, for those of us who do not have a central committee, this also implies a challenge at the level of the countries for the research that is being conducted. This is quite interesting, even though sometimes clinical trials may be published or included in a national registry or international registry. Oftentimes, the lack of knowledge within the country as to what is being done in the various regions and the various cities poses a challenge. So we need to be interconnected. We need to know what is going on simultaneously. And this is a key objective, that is to say, to try to support research so that we can have more consistent results. We also need to obtain samples that can be shared with others, and this could also help us obtain better results with our own research. But this has already been consolidated at the level of the country, and this means that there could be a significant contribution to act with solidarity with other countries in the region, with other participants, and also to contribute internationally, since we face situations such as the one that we are currently witnessing. COVID caught us without any knowledge on the disease, knowledge on the treatment, and this was learned as the situation evolved, and the result of the research was even more important than before to be able to convey this rapidly to all of the scientific community, because oftentimes there was not enough time and we needed to use the first results to be able to identify treatment, or we heard from others that the results were not satisfactory and that we needed to change course. So for that reason, I would say that monitoring the various situation is key. And I think that in these situations, this is a key pillar in the work that the committees have to do. Because of what I just said, they need to be open to what is going on and also the results that are being observed, so that from the various studies, so that these can be systematized, centralized, and shared with other communities. This quick review of the results may also lead us to suspend some of the trials or suspend some of the interventions that have not been approved yet, but that follow the lines of something that is not being useful, and also to strengthen the fact that we could have more participants for an intervention that is being positive. And finally, so that this is not too lengthy, I would like to mention two things. I think it is very important to emphasize on communication with the communities that oftentimes are more vulnerable, or that in a way have less access to information, and they confuse a research trial with the clinical intervention, and sometimes they think that the trial has already been consolidated and they request that intervention, even though we are seeing that the result is not effective. This is what happened during the pandemic. We had several situations, and the document clearly shows some studies that came to an end because it was obvious that they were not having good results. But in general, this society is not aware of this, and they continue to demand the same treatment whenever they have a relative that makes it to a hospital in a serious condition, with a serious condition, and these individuals are unaware that this is an intervention that has not been approved or that is not efficient. So for that reason, it is important to have a dialogue with the community, but also because it is basic for handling and working during an epidemic such as this one. We need to establish the trust of the health authorities so that the measures implemented by the authorities are welcome, and they also have a coherent response from the society, also understanding that the decisions were made based on reasonable evidence that allow us to see that that is the best course of action to protect the population and obtain better results when facing an epidemic or an outbreak. Finally, to answer the question posed by Carla in connection to the challenge we have, I think that this document poses the urgency of preparing to plan ahead how to act, how the country will act faced with a similar situation, and also to have the time to do it ahead of time so that we are not caught off guard in the midst of an emergency. Why am I saying this? Because some countries offered a response that was later than expected because there was no previous experience, but also because there were some other pieces of research that were underway in all of the system when we were trying to see how to centralize the work, how to work and communicate in an active fashion, and also in keeping with the timelines, that may not have happened because the reaction was delayed and there was no thinking into how to act according to the guidelines that we already have. So I think that the challenge we have when we look at this document is to be able to start to work ahead of time, how to present a proposal for planning in our countries so that we are all aware how to act faced with these situations to address research and research that is still underway to try to improve the health of our people. So I think that these would be the most important comments to give rise to give so that we can move on to a discussion. Thank you, Carla. We thank you, Jimena, for sharing your points of view as part of the health authorities that are analyzing ethics in research, such as in Chile.
Just now, and I'm gonna introduce Dr. Mike Campbell. So he's gonna be talking to us from the perspective of a research ethics committee. So Dr. Campbell is a senior lecturer in behavioral science and psychology and the deputy dean for research and graduate studies in the Faculty of Medical Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill in Barbados. So he's a psychologist, and he's been very involved in ethics review of research. Well, also before COVID, and we're very happy to have you with us, Mike. And just one more thing, I'm gonna say, los para si quieren, si no vieron inicialmente
If you did not look at hear the instructions at the beginning, just to make sure that you are listening to listening to the presentation in Spanish, please choose the interpretation globe icon and click Spanish. Mike, go ahead.
Thanks for being with us.
Okay, good afternoon, Carla. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by just saying thanks for the opportunity to participate in this event, and thanks to PAHO also for producing a seminal document that I think is much needed throughout the hemisphere. And as most of you know, Barbados is a small island developing state, and University of the West Indies is an institution that serves primarily small island developing states. And so much of my perspective has been informed by doing research ethics in that kind of context. But what I think is that even listening to the earlier comments from the two previous speakers, that there are important areas of overlap with issues that are common in the hemisphere, and some increased opportunities for collaboration, even in spite of language barriers that might exist. And so as I was reviewing the document and thinking about challenges more operationally in terms of barriers and facilitators to research ethics review process, one of the most important take-home messages, at least from my perspective, is that our lessons from emergencies, including COVID, really magnify existing gaps and needs in our research ethics system, and at the same time, of course, do have given rise to awareness of some situation-specific needs for agility, flexibility, and due diligence in research ethics review during emergencies. But even those situation-specific needs are contextualized by more structural issues that I think are part of the world in which we function. I should also say at the outset that the Caribbean region, or at least the Anglophone Caribbean region, has historically seen relatively few trials, especially pharmaceutical trials. But it's worth pointing out that a number of countries in the region, including Barbados, have aspirations to increase capacity for research and production of pharmaceuticals. And so some of the needs that you all have been discussing, I think, are increasingly relevant for all of the countries in the region, including those of us who are in relatively small countries here in the Caribbean. And so I just itemized a few lessons that I think we have taken from our experience in COVID that I think illustrate the points made in the guidance, and I hope point to I hope are helpful in the need to translate sort of aspirational guidance to specific actions at individual countries and for individual committees. So the first is really thinking about training and staffing of research ethics committees and research ethics committee staff in a more proactive way. And I think that the context of COVID has really brought home the point that the research ethics community is small. it's a small community within small countries in the Caribbean. And so events like this and all the work of PAHO, and for that matter, the work of the Bioethics Society of the English-speaking Caribbean as well, are really crucial to build not just awareness of ethics, but the ability to actually do ethics process, both from the perspective of a researcher, but from the perspective of committee members as well. Having said that, we have also learned what I think are instructive lessons about the nature of emergency research in small island states. And I say this watching hurricanes, hurricane news this week. And so I'm also aware that some of these lessons about emergency research are unfortunately not as much of an emergency as we would like, because there are countries in the region for whom these kind of major disruptions are increasingly common. And so many research ethics committees will deal with these issues more routinely than we might wish them to have to. So issues around thinking about methods, changes in research methodology when research projects are part of needed public health, civil defense, or emergency interventions. So a good example of this was a project, actually I was involved as a researcher, not as an ethics committee member, but a survey in the aftermath of the last hurricane in St. Croix in 2019, in which a community-based organization wanted to do a rapid needs assessment of households for basic structural damage and public health needs and acute healthcare needs. And their sampling methodology was specifically designed to target neighborhoods where they knew, either neighborhoods that were socioeconomically marginalized or neighborhoods that were particularly hard hit by the storm. And of course, the reason for that was that the study had two purposes, right? It was to document the extent of damage, but also to get resources to needed areas. So this is an example of which the sampling outside of that context would have been inadequate, really, for the research question, but was necessary for the intervention. And I would also say that we have learned that regional collaboration is really crucial, and this is all the more necessary when the members of the Research Ethics Committee are themselves impacted by the emergency. Now, certainly COVID is an example in which everybody globally was impacted, although the magnitude of impact varied across contexts. But certainly in the Caribbean or in parts of the region that are subject to other kinds of disasters, such as seismic disasters, right? There is a localized impact that reduces the capacity of research ethics of research ethics committee members to be able to function. And so the issue around having reciprocity agreements, having thought through ahead of time where resources are, and making sure that those resources have appropriate training in terms of understanding regions for which they might have a responsibility in during emergencies is part of the infrastructure that I think we would like to develop. And along those lines, we have to recognize that in small societies, even more so, research ethics committee members have multiple roles. Many of them are, functioning clinicians. They may be doing work for ministries of health, and the issue of member fatigue is real. And so expanding research ethics committee capacities, not in reaction to an emergency, but in terms of ongoing training, even if some members are, held in reserve, I think is crucial to be able to respond, for members to be able to respond in reasonable ways. And the last couple of points I have here, because I do not want to take too much time away from broader discussion, is that we learned a lot about considering the impact of research on ongoing response efforts and on the health systems that are impacted. And so operationally, that translates into thinking about the risk-benefit ratio of any proposed research project and how to think in emergency situations about prioritizing relevant or helpful research initiatives that have crucial nearer-term impact, and as opposed to other projects that may, in fact, run the risk of taking up resources, human resources, and material resources in times of distress for research that is not crucial. And along those lines, though, thinking about the impact on the researchers themselves. And one of the things in our region, of which we were aware, and we worked with the university and others to make accommodations, is that research projects for graduate students and even our medical residents are required for graduation. And so delays in research that might not, the ongoing research that might not be crucial to emergency response efforts had unattended consequences because it placed a barrier in the ability of newly trained specialists to be able to practice independently. So I think that points also to the lesson of understanding where you are and how the sort of structures and mechanisms of the environment in which you're operating may be impacted by delays, and factoring those into assessing risk and benefit of interventions. I think for now, that is enough from me, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mike. I'm gonna introduce now to Sara Carracedo, who works with me at PAHO's regional program on bioethics, and Sara will moderate the discussion. We've had lots of comments, and Jimena, Mike, if you can, it'd be great if you can stay tuned, because we're gonna have a session that's as dialogic as possible. And please, colleagues, it helps us a lot if your questions go to the Q&A as opposed to the chat, so they're easier to identify. Y bueno, volvemos al español. Sara, adelante.
Going back to Spanish, Sara, go ahead. Thank you very much, Carla, for the presentation. How is everybody? As Carla said, I will be in charge of moderating this part of the session. And to begin with, I wanted to highlight what we've learned in the region and globally since Zika, is that research is a key central element of any response to any healthcare emergency. And we could even extend this, or we should extend this, to emergencies caused by natural disasters, which were mentioned by Mike. There are a number of questions in both the chat room and in the Q&A room. I'd like to ask everyone to submit your questions through the Q&A. And I'd like to begin with some questions related to any research coordination efforts. As Carla mentioned at the outset, during the COVID pandemic, one of the trends was conducting small, limited scale studies. And the idea was not to do this, but quite the contrary, to undertake large multicentric trials, etc. But one of the recommendations is that healthcare authorities should coordinate any research efforts, for example, through the establishment of a list of priorities for research or through an expert network. The question posed by Florencia is whether this recommendation might be considered a bit authoritarian when we tell the authorities or when we yield the task to authorities to designate who conducts the research and what have you. I think that we could look at this coordination of efforts related to research in a different way. How do you see this? I'd like to start, but I'm keen to listen or hear from Jimena from the Healthcare Authority. I think that in a way, Florencia's question really places the finger in one of the most painful wounds that we have in the region. And the recommendation is rather humble and modest in the sense that we've all said that at a certain point in time, we all complained about the lack of coordination. Oh my God, there's no coordination whatsoever. Oh my God. And at some point, we finally asked, well, wait a minute, who's supposed to be doing the coordination? And that's when we had our aha moment. And we thought, well, if we haven't asked anybody to coordinate, then of course we won't have any coordination. So to the extent that that was happening, the reasoning was that as research is a key element of the response, and we need to look at it from that standpoint, and the coordination aspect is looking for that follow-up to the response. There is a role to be played by the healthcare authority, but at the same time, we could say, well, we have national health institutes, and in different places, we have people that are under the umbrella of the healthcare authority, but that have a specific research role. And these would be the most appropriate entities that show the most aptitude for this task and that we should involve. Nevertheless, Florencia's question really goes hand in hand with some of the recommendations that we submitted for conceptualization, because we still don't know as of yet exactly what's involved in this coordination process. And that's something that we need to think about now, because we know that A, we have to coordinate, B, somebody has to have that task of coordinating, but how this is all going to work, we frankly don't know. I don't know what you think about this, Jimena, from the standpoint of the healthcare authority. Thank you very much. I think the question posed by Florencia is extremely valid because it could be seen as authoritarian in the sense that it could be perceived as the authority trying to exert control over everything that's happening. But I don't see it in that way. I think that, as Carla said, we need to look at this as a need for coordination and a need for somebody to be designated to undertake that coordination. Now, we've seen a tremendous amount of disinformation and a lot of chaos, and so it would be important for us to centralize these efforts and that we call upon the people that are the most knowledgeable in the field and most experienced, and by extension, the most qualified to assess what's happening with research and what will, in the end, be the greatest risk to the population. When we were talking about the pandemic, we weren't just trying to save people, but also undertake research that would serve to collect information related to all of the stakeholders and that would allow us to mitigate any future risk. So there needs to be a way for us to call upon the different field specialists, people that are specializing in laboratory and epidemiology, research, what have you. We need to come up with a list of these people and put them all in a centralized location, or at least a conceptual centralized location, so that they can address all the issues related to the healthcare of the entire country. On the other hand, we see that in situations such as this, we also need to take into account any conflicts of interest. And we've seen that in some research projects, when we see a situation that points to a specific group, people that are working on the development of vaccines, or the development of any product line, at a certain point in time, this could represent a great opportunity for that product line. And for that, I think we would need an independent entity that could ensure that these conflicts of interest do not interfere in the ethical scientific assessment of the research projects. And lastly, I think that the idea behind this centralized concept would be to promote the coordination and communication related to what's happening at the national level. Otherwise, we won't have any entities that may have knowledge about any studies that are being conducted in different countries or different places, and we may not know about that. And we might have a situation where people will say, you can't justify the replication of this. And instead, we would have, this was done at some point in time. It proved to be very risky, and therefore we shouldn't replicate this process. But who will take charge of that task? And so the authorities need to not only provide oversight for these approaches, they need to ensure that the application that is developed is adequate, but we also need to take a very close, careful look at who's doing the research. So we need to come up with some type of an agreement as to what that entity will be, and with any people that participate in this process, we need to ensure that it's not seen as some kind of an authoritarian move, but rather an effort to coordinate all of our efforts. Thank you, Jimena. I'm wondering if Mike would like to chime in, perhaps give us the Caribbean perspective.
Well, I think that this is another example of emergencies highlighting existing needs, particularly in the Caribbean, where a series of small island developing states collectively would be the size of a medium-sized country in South America, right? And so our capacity to deal with conflicts of interest, to marshal appropriate areas of specialized expertise for, particularly in terms of, we do not have, for example, national regulatory authorities for pharmaceuticals, right? We'd have ministries of health that have broad general missions. And so our capacity to deal with both the review and the technical monitoring and in fact, the expertise to produce is going to require working together. Working together in the Caribbean, and I think also as well in the hemisphere, right, and more globally, to be able to resource and staff these kinds of needs appropriately.
Bien, gracias, Mike. Hay una
Very well,
pregunta.
thank you, Mike. We have a question about research ethics committees, which I think it's more than pertinent. And during the pandemic, one of the challenges, without a doubt, was finding different ways to get support for these ethical committees, and in such a way that they could be durable over time. And there's mentioned here, for example, that many research ethics committees undertook heroic efforts just to survive. And it wasn't just during this emergency, but also during ordinary situations that happen in different contexts in the region. One of the PAHO recommendations is to attach a much more professional view to these research ethics committees, and that the different stakeholders involved in the committees should be compensated. But one of the questions is, how can we implement this when so far up to now, there are many units that have many conflicts of interest, and these ethical committees need to be distanced from any type of compensation. And I don't know if Chile or Barbados undertook any measures in this regard. I don't know if anybody has something that they want to mention in this regard. Mike, back to you.
There's a few very practical questions. Chiefly among them is who has the money to pay anybody. But apart from that, right, the issue you raise about how actually, there are a couple of things embedded there. One is compensation might not absolutely equate to professionalism, and so it might encourage professionalism. But part of the issue around ongoing training and in fact acknowledgement of the role. So, for example, for faculty members, right, to have acknowledgement of that as part of your academic and public service, and to perhaps have release time from teaching and all of that. So not all compensation always directly requires new resources. I would also say that there, at least in the Caribbean, there have been some efforts toward this. The CARFA committee, for example, actually does compensate members, not extravagantly, but on a compensation for their time to review. One of the things that I would say, and we're in the process of implementing this at University of the West Indies, and I suspect, I don't know where we are in terms of our colleagues in the region, whether we're far ahead or behind or somewhere in the middle, but a more formalized conflict of interest declaration that members are required to sign, and that is available publicly. And that sort of more formalized rather than expected issue around potential conflicts of interest, I think, is helpful. And it's helpful not just as an assurance, it's helpful in terms of structuring training and expectations for members from the time that they join. And that is at least one effort, I hope, pointing us in the right direction. But in terms of resources for compensation, I think that that's going to be an ongoing challenge in a lot of places.
Thank you, Mike. Jimena, did you want to add anything? Yes, I wanted to contribute something. I think it's fascinating because I think that this is a topic that's been mentioned in many places, practically in all our countries in the region, but we need to undertake an effort to focus on the professionalism involved in this work. I'd like to share some insights from my experience in Chile. We've tried to formalize these research ethics committees. And so through the healthcare authorities, when we assess any biomedical elements involving human beings, they are subject to this rigorous scientific protocol. And part of the accreditation criteria includes that people that work in that committee are dedicated to certain tasks. And it's not that they're being compensated for their participation in the ethics committee, but rather if we're talking about a hospital administrator or somebody that works for a hospital or some other healthcare organization, they are dedicating time perhaps away from their regular duties to contribute to the ethics committee. And that's what they're trying to get some form of compensation for. And I believe that that's the only way, as Dr. Campbell said, that we still need people that need to improve their skills, continuously undertake training and the necessary assessments to be able to undertake their respective roles in the proper way. When we talk about these different people from different committees, if we were to establish a centralized ad hoc committee and we came up with some form of a structure for such a committee to address an emerging issue, then any time that would be dedicated to that effort should be considered when addressing the issue of compensation or remuneration. In addition to the fact that this type of work needs to be adequately recognized. I wanted to add something with regard to the issue of conflicts of interest. It's surprising to me that we continue to have this discussion when I've never heard that people that work in the national regulatory authorities who review the protocols of the clinical trials for their authorization, these people get a salary. Nobody works for a national regulatory authority for free. Nevertheless, I've never heard of anyone say that there's a conflict of interest because that person receives a salary to review protocols on behalf of the national regulatory authority. So what is it that makes us think that if the person in charge of the ethical review may be involved in a conflict of interest when at the same time a member of the national regulatory authority gets payment for their efforts, and I don't see their respective roles as being that different. I understand the question, or I understand that the person that posed the question may be looking for arguments in favor of setting something up. And we hope to be useful, but when you say hire an attorney and you pay that attorney a fee, you're not paying them to violate any laws. And when we think about solutions and of course challenges that were mentioned by both Mike and Jimena, I think that many times people say to us, look, we have a strategy, presumably, supposedly, they tell you that this is like protected time, but in practice, that's not the case. So I think that we all agree that we have to have different ways, not that it's just about compensation with money, but there are different challenges in trying to find different ways to come up with genuine forms of compensation. Otherwise, we're just creating a situation whereby we'd have people who could allow themselves the luxury of serving on an ethics committee because they come from a rich family, or they have a position with a very great salary, or a person that has a lot of economic resources. And the rest of the population in the healthcare arena wouldn't be able to serve. So we don't want to create that type of scenario. What we're doing right now is working at PAHO on the development of a tool for the certification of these ethical committees that can be used by national authorities. And we've included a question related to the issue of compensation, because I think that this situation really implies a lot of challenges. And Mike, I'm not making less light of this. I do know that money is short for and scarce for everybody, but we could perhaps work to put something on the table that would be more disciplined and more practical, because otherwise we're not going to go anywhere with this. Thank you very much for your answers. And I might be able to join some comments here that I read and pose it in the form of a single question. I think that the pandemic has identified the roles of the authorities and the various committees and the importance of having adequate collaboration and coordination. We can't have the committees working independently in an isolated silo type way. So we need to have bidirectional and multilateral communication and coordination. So the question that was posed and that I would like to direct at Carla, I'd like to ask you to explain this two-prong approach to review the strategy of some of these mechanisms to address emergencies and how isolated stakeholders can develop anything on their own. Clearly, we need some rapid response mechanisms, but how is that achievable when these different committees are working on their own? That's one question. The other question I'd like to direct to Mike and Jimena and ask that you share any insights based on your own experience or some initiative that you have been involved with that relates to any coordination or collaboration between authorities and these committees, and how perhaps these could be applicable to other countries and other institutions. Go ahead. Well, let me get started with this, and then I'll yield the floor to Jimena and Mike. Let's see. At PAHO, we've been working at the request of the member states using a systematic approach. So we try to identify all the key stakeholders or all of the stakeholders and what we need to implement for this process to be an ethical one. And this is an exercise that has forced us to have a more comprehensive view beyond just looking at these ethical committees as atoms that exist in a completely disassociated way from the national authorities, research authorities, researchers, and those entities that finance research. As you well know, in many countries, if not all of the countries in our region, during emergency or non-emergency situations, a research protocol is undergoes a review process through various committees. And imagine, just based on simplicity, because I only have 10 fingers on my hands, in one country, imagine 10 committees reviewing a protocol. And we're in the midst of a healthcare emergency, and each one of these committees have these rapid procedures. But what does this mean? Just in this country, we're going to have 10 rapid assessments. And regardless of how rapid they are, we're still talking about 10 of these. And I think this is a bit excessive. And frankly, this is excessive for even non-emergency situations. And based on what Mike and Jimena have told us, we need to look at ways to work in a more coordinated fashion and avoid just duplicating our efforts, because as we've heard many times, we don't have a surplus of resources and time. So we need to try and eliminate these unnecessary reviews. So when we talk about committees not working in isolation, when we see these individual committees do what they do, we could get to many rapid reviews. In one case, I think we had 19 reviews in one country, and it was just addressing one single protocol. That's the one that came to mind. So to my mind, this is 18 more than what was really necessary. So in order to avoid this multiplicity of reviews, even when they're extremely expedited, when we talk about strategies, how can we ensure that the review is rapid, but also not something that is duplicated? So if we consider this as a first step, clearly we won't have a one-size-fits-all solution. There are some countries that are structured in such a way that make them more susceptible to certain types of solutions, others that, because of their size, have more suitability for other solutions. So the idea would be for us to propose a menu of strategies that, similar to the menu in a restaurant, would allow for the flexibility to order a salad with the dressing on the side. And we need to be able to add this flexibility to adapt these products accordingly. The idea is to avoid the duplication of efforts on the review process, but we need to first come up with a strategy at the national level. And then, regardless of the strategy that we come up with, if you designate committees, if you conduct meetings, if you create an ad hoc committee, whatever strategy you choose, the committee that is tasked with the review needs to be able to undertake that review process in the most expeditious way possible. Thank you, Carla. I don't know if Mike and Jimena would like to answer the other part of the question, talk about any personal experience or any initiatives that you've been involved with that relates to communication, coordination between national authorities and committees. And many times we always have a need for this type of framework, especially in emergency situations, but also in non-emergency ones. Well, all I can say is that in the experience in our country, we established an ad hoc committee to precisely work on these situations and determine how we would proceed. But much of the work was reactive and not proactive. And unfortunately, the work of that committee that was created was not really very timely, because we already had a number of trials that were underway by the time they got off the ground. So what I like about the document and what it proposes is how we anticipate these situations and address them in a timely and appropriate way. In terms of experiences, our bioethics office, ascribed to the Ministry of Health, works very closely with these scientific committees because they fall under the umbrella of the healthcare authority. So they work to strengthen the work of the committees, and they place a very heavy focus on training. And in last July, we had a workshop with the accredited scientific committees in the country. We had Catalyzing at that event, and the idea was to promote these activities, that we could share this training with the different committees to not only professionalize their work a little bit more, but to ensure that there was contact and more communication and coordination among the committees, and to ensure that certain committees could learn from the others. So we tried to ask them what standard gaps we have that precluded us from having more standardized assessments. I do believe that there is a possibility of being able to organize this in a certain way, keeping in mind from the committee standpoint what their experience is in their work, day-to-day work, and what they face, and how we can come up with a response standard that will fit their needs. I don't think this is necessarily very complex. It does require a great deal of proactive work, joint work, but I don't believe this to be something that is so complex in nature that it will be too challenging. And the idea would be to undertake a better scientific evaluation or assessment, while at the same time keeping in mind the necessary rigor that it's required.
So this is an endemic issue, I think, in a lot of places and in the Caribbean. And if I had one summary statement, it is that when considering what contributes to length of time of approvals, we want to increase the ratio of due diligence to bureaucratic burden. And we have made, so, you know, in the Caribbean, because we have ministries of health, but most countries do not have designated drug national regulatory authorities for pharmaceuticals, for example, the coordination is a little different. But there are some things that we have done that I think have been helpful. For one, the University of the West Indies, which includes just about every country in the English-speaking Caribbean, has established a protocol for cross-campus reviews for regional proposals that involve data collection in different countries. Until a couple of years ago, really just before COVID, actually, researchers working across different Caribbean countries had to go to the research ethics committees in each country individually. And you can imagine that that burden was enormous in some cases. And so we now have an integrated system in which one country's committee takes a lead review with input from a designated member from the committee of another country in tandem with the process. And part of that is a technological innovation, because we have moved to an online proposal tracking system that the university uses regionally, and so we can do that simultaneously. At the level of conversations between ministries of health and research ethics committees, there's a lot of variation in the region. In Barbados, we are unique, as far as I know, in that the University Research Ethics Committee has a memorandum of understanding that allows us to function as a national ethics committee doing service for the Ministry of Health. And so in Barbados, there is really one-stop shopping. But in other countries, for example, the landscape in Trinidad is more complex, and in Jamaica as well. Although I know, and I saw in the audience, there are some colleagues from Trinidad here. I know that they are making some tangible efforts actually to look at just this issue there. But I don't have expert knowledge of the latest myself about that, but I imagine that some of the people here do.
I thank you, Mike, for sharing Barbados experience. Now I would like to ask a question on the research ethics standards. We also know that it doesn't matter whether it is a health emergency, the research ethics standards applicable to research protocols are always the same. There is no reason to be more flexible about them. Now, the question is, if we have so many ethics committees, how do we make sure that they all apply the ethics standards properly? How do we make sure that the committees during emergencies apply, discuss on the research protocols in observance or in keeping with the research standards? I don't know if anyone has a comment regarding this. I have a comment. And as I share my comment, I am going to share with you the link to the international ethics standards. I would like to add that the idea of having a centralized presentation for the projects within an entity that has various members of the ethics committee would be a way to harmonize or to she was muted momentarily, but I was saying that by creating more of a centralized institution with the support of various members from various committees, that would allow for a more homogeneous ethical scientific assessment for all of the projects that are presented in this area. This would prevent this diversity of evaluation and points of view, which often lead to some concerns, since a committee may approve something that another one may not approve. So if we have different criteria, this would be a way to avoid the differences. I also believe that there may be two aspects to the question. On the one hand, what are the guidelines that we invoke to carry out the ethics review of a specific protocol. And the standard, the ethics standards and the most comprehensive standards, the ones that are the most updated and more in detail, are the SIOMS guidelines that I shared. I shared it in Spanish. It is available, of course, in English too. Now, even with the application of SIOM standards, there may be some differences because ethics needs analysis and weighing different points of view and arguments. And it doesn't mean that because we analyze the ethics from under the same ethical guidelines, ethics is going to become an algorithm that automatically everyone has the same position. That is not the case. So we need to clearly identify harmonization, make sure that we all observe the ethical standards that are the most updated. And this is not something that lacks importance because oftentimes within PAHO we receive a consultation. Can we have broad consultation on ethics? And we say, yes. It is acceptable to have a waiver for consent? Yes. And these are the criteria to be applied. So we can invoke the same 3 criteria and we can have a discussion. It doesn't mean that because we invoke SIOM standards, this becomes mathematical, but we have greater harmony. We focus more on substantive issues. And I am thinking about something that Jimena mentioned at the beginning regarding the coordination among the various committees. We might be missing greater dialogue among the committees sometimes, and this is not something that we do in all cases, but we do this within the bioethics committee here at PAHO. We review a protocol that we think it has some issues and it has already been approved by an ethics committee. So that ethics committee, that's where we know someone and we have the certainty of having a dialogue. So of being able to have a dialogue, why don't we just pick up the phone and say, okay, why don't we analyze something and we express our differences? Oftentimes they say, well, I hadn't realized that this was the case, or we didn't think that this was an issue because X. And this is kind of a continuation of the deliberation that we had at the beginning where our own committee, we continue with this with a different committee. And these are spaces in which, as a member of an ethics committee, I learn a great deal. We hear someone else's point of view. And oftentimes we say, everything looks quite good, but if you ask me how you are going to work with potential participants, they said this or that. For example, that they are going to obtain the list of individuals who are HIV positive in the country. So sometimes, based on the experience we all have, we can go into some aspects that were not obvious to others who have a different kind of experience. So we might think about the strategies to exchange learnings and lessons in a more efficient manner so that we can build upon that. In the US, there was a list of an email list. I don't know, I might not be receiving it now. I think it was called IRB.net. And every day there was a consultation, a question, several emails. So what do you think of this, that? So again, I'm talking about something that has been in existence for more than 15 years. So now the strategies may be different. The questions need to have its own, have to be made with care. But we might want to have more options for a dialogue to discuss more specific aspects and see how we can learn from our colleagues, and also get rid of that idea that because a committee did not approve a proposal that was approved by a different committee, someone is doing something wrong. Someone is wrong, someone is right. No, there is a healthy space for disagreement, a reasonable space that may be justified. And the conversation should be welcome as opposed to someone is scolding me. Or at least that's what I believe. Thank you. Mike, do you have something to add regarding this, or should we move on to another question?
Maybe just something very briefly, that I think elevating training and communication across committees is likely to reduce the need for multiple committees and multiple levels, because when individual decision makers are more confident, maybe not in specific outcomes, but in the general approach, good faith, competency of other committees to work, then the idea that the geography of review has to be so segmented and multiple layers becomes less necessary.
Thank you. I was looking at the questions, and I would like to add something also based on what Mike said and several comments that we received, several questions. That is, I believe that sometimes there is lack of trust among the institutions and the committees and the participants. We need to create trust, because we might have a measure, for example, that is suggested to be reviewed. Let's review this, but if there is no trust among the various committees and we're not doing this, meaning that they believe that we're doing this seriously, that it is something that since they know that there is no simple or single algorithm, or it is something that will never fail, this will not work without this trust. In several countries, and to generate trust among the various committees, we have, first of all, in several countries, we have had training sessions on a monthly basis with all of the committees. And the fact that they all get together virtually, but they still get together to realize that we are all working along the same lines and that we are all struggling with the same issues, that we are trying to do a good job, that helps to develop trust. And something that we did within PAHO was to have an internship system, by means of which a committee, let's say that you have a participant in a new committee, or there is a new participant in an old committee, so that participant may request to be an observer during the discussions of a different committee. That generates more of a cordial dialogue, more of a collaboration among the committees, and also solve some needs we might have in terms of training, because once again, we're looking for the training that is more structured. But I think that we have all lived through this. It is difficult to learn how to carry out an ethics analysis, and I think that that helps. Sarah? I think that you have already addressed my last question. Dr. Lema is asking whether we can include these monthly sessions on training. Could you please, Carla, explain quickly how you carry them out? Yes, with several countries, we have some sessions on a monthly basis for training purposes, but these are sessions that we organize with the health authorities. So in each case, the health authority chooses the most appropriate modality. For example, Jimena was just explaining that we had this training activity, a full room, and then we had a follow-up virtual session, but it was an activity concentrated in Chile, but in other countries. For example, I am thinking of Paraguay, Bolivia, etc. We have sessions on a monthly basis with the ethics committee within each country, and the health authority is the one inviting us to that session. So PAHO is not inviting people from other countries, but it is always a good idea to recall that this option is available for the health authorities that might be interested in a training program that has more continuity with PAHO. The advantage of doing it in that fashion and virtually is that the costs are so good that they are zero. Thank you very much, Carla. I see that there are several questions on the multi-center reviews by several ethics committees. And that is very good because that is one of the recommendations for conceptualization. So it is useful to have this dialogue. And I just want to ask something before we conclude the session. I think it is clear that many of the reviews do not necessarily imply more regulation. Why is it that as members of the committee, we are difficult to let go of all of the rules when we, why is it difficult for us to review some of the elements, and some have requested to have a lower number of committees so that we do not have so many opinions. But my question was, in connection with those agreements, those trust agreements among the committees, those agreements do not imply, okay, you are going to review everything and you will be responsible. But it also, there is a single IRB review that can give us some ideas to how to develop these agreements. It is not something that is that simple, but it shouldn't be that complicated. And I would like to conclude with this question so that we have a clearer view. If you want, I can start to answer. You know that in the US, a policy was implemented for all of the studies to be carried out in the country to have the approval of just one committee. It doesn't indicate what committee that is, but just one committee. And the idea clearly was for this to be a way to overcome the issue that we are faced with. Some countries within the region wanted to make progress along these lines, and we said, why? Why shouldn't we take advantage of this opportunity to avoid the difficulties that others already had? And we are going to talk to our colleagues from the US authorities, and we are going to hear what was difficult, what got delayed, what happened, and what all the barriers were, so that we cannot replicate them in our region. And the truth of the matter is that with Sarah, we had some very interesting dialogues that were quite enlightening. And I think that this topic should be part of a regional session in order to facilitate and streamline. At the outset, the process ended up taking a long time for the research, something that everyone thought was going to satisfy the researchers, led them to have many headaches. And then we saw different solutions along the way. And one of the most difficult topics was, if that institution, let's imagine that I am a university. As a university, I am responsible for making sure that my research is ethical. I have my ethics committee, and now I am not going to review. Rather, the ethics committee that Mike leads from the West Indies University will review my protocol. Let's imagine that something goes wrong with that protocol. Who is responsible? Mike's committee, Mike's institution, my institution, both, myself for trusting in Mike. So we need to limit the responsibility. We need to establish limits to that responsibility. What is it that we are giving up? What is it that we are not accepting anymore, or something that we're putting in someone else's hands? Sometimes we are doing this on an impromptu basis. This is part of a dialogue. Why don't you do that for me? It's just a favor. But what would happen if something goes wrong? So this is something that was considered when developing these agreements, and the agreements became more difficult than the ethics review. But we learned in the process, so we have an opportunity here in the region. There is a project called Smart IRB Contract, and it was drafted as a model contract. So I believe that there are some good strategies in the region that would allow us to make some progress. We're looking into taking that model contract and seeing how we can develop the skeleton and share it in the region, and also to determine what tools we have to avoid some of the challenges we faced in the US. But I think that this is a topic that will continue to be of interest for us in the future. This is something that we need to learn about, think creatively, because it is true that we have used other strategies in the region, and say, well, after 3 committees review, well, this is not independent, we were all together. So, or that instead of all of them reviewing, we can say, I am going to issue a decision, but I am not going to discuss this. I am just going to adopt your deliberation. So there are some options, and we should talk about the various menus we have, the menus of options, see whatever works better for us and what would work for us given the various initiatives. I know that we are running out of time, but if we look at the various experiences in the region, there are some experiences in Argentina that are new to avoid duplication, and we might have to ask our colleagues to share their firsthand experience and also the experiences in the US with the IRB, something that would help us all improve. Very well, I think that we have come to an end with the questions for today. Mike, Jimena, I'd like to thank you deeply for sharing your reflection, your experience. I think that this thinking together helps us find better solutions, and also in particular to all of us within PAHO to be sensitive to the challenges, the specific challenges that have many common characteristics, but may be different within the region. And now, so thinking that many of our recommendations are meant to become concepts later on, we thank you for any suggestion, bioethics at PAHO.org. We know that there are people who are working on their own papers and their own investigation, whether as part of a master's degree. If you'd like to share any of this with us, we'll be extremely thankful. We have made a great progress. We just need to be active in what we can implement right now, but we also need to continue thinking together. I thank you deeply. Have a good rest of the afternoon. And as usual, we are going to distribute the recording and also the slides in both languages next week. using the list on ethics research that Sarah just shared with you. I would like to thank the participants, our colleagues, our interpreters that help us carry out this session, and I would like to thank everyone. Thank you for inviting us to think. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you for the invitation.